I'm back with this 2021 Tesla Model 3, trying to make it not stink. If you haven't watched the last video, you're going to want to go watch that. I think I found a pretty significant issue and a few ways to resolve it. Now, you guys left a ton of comments on that video, and so today I wanted to put some of the ideas that you guys had to the test and see if maybe we can find another issue and talk about some of the things that you guys brought up. Like last time, I'm going to yammer on about way more than I need to, and so here are a bunch of timestamps. Feel free to skip ahead to whatever you find interesting. Let's get started. Now, one of the most frequent comments that I got was, does this gasket reduce airflow into this duct? I figured, why not test it? And so I went online and I found something called a hot wire anemometer. For some reason, this thing was just wildly inconsistent. And so I got back online and I found a different brand. And even after I had this installed, this high-end meter, it was still wildly inconsistent. In the end, I ended up finding this vane anemometer, which is a little bit more simple in how it works. It just has this little vane on here. This spins up and this thing can just measure RPMs and convert that to airspeed. And then you punch in the duct size and it can convert that into airflow. This was a lot more intrusive. I had to actually cut a big hole in the side of the duct so I could fit this thing in here. It was blocking the duct a lot more than I like, but at the end of the day, all I can do is my best. So let's see how it turned out. So there are a few scenarios that I wanted to check, one of which people were saying that this gasket would actually change the pressure under the hood, which would mean the airflow would be affected at highway speeds. I mounted the meter to my screen and then I cycled through all 10 fan settings. And then I got on the highway and I took all 10 measurements again. And then I installed the aftermarket gasket and took measurements again, both stationary and on the highway. And let's look at the results. So one of the first things that I wanted to show was that at highway speeds with the stock gasket, a lot of air is pushed into the intake rather than being pulled in by the fan. And so at lower fan speeds, you see quite a bit more airflow coming in, even though the fan is running at low speed. At higher fan speeds, however, it's just like you weren't on the highway at all. With the aftermarket gasket, however, we don't see any air being pushed in at lower speeds, and it's a lot more consistent as if you weren't on the highway at all. And next, the big question that most of you were asking about was, does this gasket actually decrease airflow? And the answer is yes. If you look at the data, airflow is reduced by about 20% and by just over 30% at the highest fan setting. And a lot of you are thinking, well, crap, I already installed this gasket. Are you saying I should take it off now? Well, probably not. You have to remember that Tesla has an automatic climate. And so if the car is hotter or colder than it needs to be, the car is going to run the fan at a high speed until it gets down to a certain temperature and then starting to ramp the speed down. And so if it's automatic, it should compensate for it. Now, that being said, it will cool the car down more slowly on a hot day. But let's say that it takes the car a full 2 minutes to cool the car down, right? Well, what's 20% of 2 minutes? Like not even 30 seconds? So you're talking about a 30-second difference between having this gasket installed and not having the gasket installed. So in my opinion, I'd rather keep water out of this duct than worry about 30 seconds, but at the end of the day, it's up to you. Now, there is another option here. I recognize that a lot of you might be a little bit more tentative about removing this entire frunk and actually seeing the guts of the car. And so, without using any tools at all, if I just pop off this cover here, I can see another little plastic trim piece here. If I just pop this off, I've now created more area here for this duct to suck in from. It can now suck in from around this inside area. There's actually quite a bit of room around the control arms and along the belly pan. It's not sealed. And so if I just put this back on now, I'm going to rerun the tests and we're going to see how much airflow there is both with and without this gasket. And we're going to see how much it's affected then. So looking at the results now, we can see that we've actually increased airflow by about 15%. And interestingly enough, we even get that gain with the aftermarket gasket installed. We don't see hardly any difference at all in the airflow when switching between the stock and the aftermarket gasket. Now, to be clear, with my car, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this gasket installed and I'm going to remove that duct entirely. That's my opinion. I think that's the best thing. I really don't want to get water in there. I don't want to have to replace filters again. But really, anything that you want to do to block water from getting into that inlet should be fine. And at the end of the day, this is your car. You're welcome to do whatever you want. All I can do is present you the data. So a lot of you left a comment and said that either you live in the desert or you never wash your car and you really don't think that water getting into the duct is the source of your problem. So while I'm confident that I found an issue, I'm not sure that it was the only issue. So I touched a little bit in the last video about the evaporator and how close it is to the cabin air filter, and I didn't think that it was an issue, but after reading some of your comments, I think that I might have dismissed it too quickly. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Dehumidifiers and air conditioners both have a set of fins called an evaporator that gets really cold and water condenses on it out of the air. Now that water needs a place to drain, and on the Model 3, it's draining here about a 1/4 inch from your cabin air filters. And so I wanted to take a closer look at what's happening when that water condenses. So this is the original cover that covers up the cabin air filters. And so I ended up 3D printing my own, but with a twist. Now what this will let me do is I've got a whole bunch of gear attached to the end of this. So I've got this flashlight and a GoPro, and I've got it hooked up to my phone so I can actually see what I'm looking at. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna stick this in this hole, and then I can go ahead and get it mostly locked in place. I put back the original screw here. Now that it's in here, we can kind of wiggle it around, get the perfect angle. And just in case it's not perfectly obvious here, the cabin air filters are not installed here. I've installed the camera in place of the cabin air filters. And now we can run a whole bunch of experiments and see if we can figure out where this moisture is coming from. So I live in Western New York, and there aren't a lot of hot, humid days. And so to simulate a hot, humid day, I took a humidifier and a space heater, and I ran it in the car with the HVAC on recirculate, so that the car would have to work to take that heat and humidity out of the air. And if you look at this video, we can see the results. So if we look at the before and after, we can see a little bit of condensation on the bottom here. So I tried running the test again with both filters in place, but I didn't really see any moisture difference when comparing before and after. And so if we look at the actual layout of the evaporator and the cabin air filters, they're at a little bit of an angle. And so any water that collects on that evaporator, it's gonna drip away from the cabin air filter. And so I thought we should try place the car at an angle so it's tilted, and we can run the test then to see if maybe it's getting dripped on. Nothing. And so then I thought, well, the water has to drain, and so maybe if the car is angled the other way, maybe water is collecting and they're not able to drain out, and then it's getting onto the filter. Again, not a drop. I thought that maybe the humidifier wasn't creating enough humidity, and so I replaced it with an electric kettle that was able to put a lot more water into the air. I ended up refilling it like twice, about 2 quarts of water I ended up putting into the air over the span of a couple hours. And after rerunning the tests, I didn't see any difference at all. So I thought that maybe there wasn't enough water collecting on the evaporator this time of year. And so I ended up taking a turkey baster and I sprayed a bunch of water in there, trying to really flood that area and make a worst case scenario. And you can see the water just flowing easily out of the drain. But to be thorough, I tried slamming on the brakes, going both forward and in reverse to try sloshing water around, but I didn't see anything exciting on the camera. I went to the grocery store at some point, went in, got some groceries. When I came out, I got in the car, and I could smell that funk. Now, I didn't have a tripod with me, but I was able to get the filters out, and I noticed that the moisture was only in the very center of this bottom filter, which is directly above that drain hole. And so that got me thinking the water's gotta be coming in from that drain hole. I found the deepest puddle that I could find, I set up my camera, and I drove through that puddle as quick as I could, just trying to flood that drain hole with it. And what I found was this. Absolutely nothing. And so then I thought, well, maybe there's got to be some other way for water to be getting in there that I'm not able to reproduce. So I took off the belly pan and I sprayed water directly into the drain hole. Again, absolutely nothing. So what's going on here? Where is this water coming from? I could see the moisture on this bottom filter. Now, when I went to get groceries, it was super humid. It had rained most of the day. It wasn't raining on the way to the grocery store, but it was like 90% humidity still, and it was pretty chilly. It was like in the mid 40s Fahrenheit. And so I thought today I'd see if I could try to reproduce that scenario, because you can see it's super crappy out, pretty cold, above 90% humidity. And so I'm gonna drive around for a little bit. I'm gonna come back, I'm gonna measure the moisture of the filter when I get back, and then I'm gonna let it sit for about 20 minutes, and then I'm gonna measure it again, and we're gonna see what the humidity is. So I've just gone for a drive. 15%, 11, 13, 14, 14. So I put the filter back in. I'm gonna wait about 20 minutes, and we're gonna see if the moisture is any different after the car has cooled down. So again, I've got this bottom filter. I'm gonna measure. Wow, 28%, 25, 24, 42% here on this back part here in the center. 52%, 45. So we definitely have another moisture issue. It's pretty strange. It's just from the car sitting. Oh. I got fed up with not being able to see what I was working on, and so I bought this entire HVAC module. You'll recognize this intake here. This is where our duct would connect to. You'll recognize the little door here where we change cabin air filters. This is the module that lives in the Model 3 and the Model Y. So now that we have this, we can actually look at the inside up close and see what the drainage system looks like. So if we flip this thing on its side, we can see this drain here. This is what I believe would seal against the floor. We have this here that would seal against the firewall. I've taken these screws out here. This can just slide out, and that exposes this drain here. I've taken out some screws here, and this entire drain basin can just come out. We don't get to see this every day, so I thought I would take a few seconds and just go through this. We have a lot of ducts all over the place that are distributing air throughout the car. Over here we have the intake that we've seen before. This is the intake for recirculate. So it's a little door that just rotates here to determine whether or not it's going to suck from outside air or from in the cabin. We have the cabin air filter door here that we're all very familiar with. And then down here we have both the evaporator and an in-cabin condenser. You can see that this module was made in November 2022, and so this would come with the heat pump version of the Model 3 and the Model Y. And so the big question is, does the water that condenses on this evaporator collect on the cabin air filter somehow? Well, we should come over and look at this drain assembly. So looking at this a little bit more closely, this is the drain that we've been seeing in our GoPro shots from earlier in this video. So the cabin air filters are resting in this channel here, and we then have a much deeper channel here where the evaporator sits in. If we look down inside, we have a drain hole that's pretty deep in this basin. There's room for quite a bit of water to collect in here, and we have a pretty significant lip right here that's separating the cabin air filter from the evaporator. Spraying water up through this drain hole isn't really going to be able to go backwards and get on the cabin air filter, so that explains why that test didn't yield any results. And in terms of condensation on here, the only way that I could see condensation forming on there is if like maybe the fan was running backwards and sucking this way. They wouldn't do that, would they? So I mentioned in the last video that Tesla runs the fan for a few minutes after you've driven the car to attempt to dry out this system. But it occurs to me that I didn't really know any details around what's actually happening when it does that. I tied a piece of yarn to this screen so I could see which way the fan is blowing so that I could go for a drive and actually record what's happening with this fan so we can see how Tesla's trying to dry out this system. Let's take a look. So I start the timer the second I get out of the car. We can see after 2 minutes, Tesla closes the recirculate door. After 10 minutes, they reopen the recirculate door and start to dry out the filters, and you can see from the yarn that it's pulling air in normally. It's not running backwards. And then close to 20 minutes after that, they stop trying to dry the filters and leave the door open. So at this point, I think it's clear what happened. I went for a drive, tested, the filters were dry, and then Tesla tried to dry the filters out, and the filters got moist. So when I was driving around, I was trying to dry these filters out as much as I could. And so I was running the air on recirculate with heat and AC. So the AC is going to pull the moisture out. The heat is going to help make more room in the air for the moisture to come out of these filters. Drying it, heating it into the cabin, and we have warm, dry air coming in the recirculate to hit this filter again. Now when Tesla tries to dry it out, it's sucking in cold, moist air. And the first thing it's going to do is hit this filter. So I think Tesla's making this problem worse. So I recognize that this is a pretty bold claim, and so it's another really crappy, humid day. I've gone for another drive and measured the filters when I got back, but this time I disconnected the high voltage battery. By disconnecting the high voltage battery, Tesla disables non-essential features, which includes their drying technique. So if we run this same test without Tesla's drying technique and the filters stay dry, that's going to prove that it's Tesla's drying technique that's causing this issue. So it's been about 25 minutes. I have this bottom filter, and we're going to measure 11%, 13, 12. So the moisture doesn't seem to have changed at all. And so in my opinion, this is kind of a smoking gun that says that it's Tesla's drying technique that's making moisture condense in the bottom of this filter. Now I'm not sure why moisture is only condensing above this drain hole, but if you have an idea, feel free to let me know in the comments, but give me a way to test it so I can prove whether or not your theory is true. Now I've got a few ways that Tesla can fix this, and I've got a few ways that you can fix this. So if you work for Tesla, you know somebody that works for Tesla, I think you need to take humidity into consideration when doing this drying technique. I think I've demonstrated that we're making the problem worse by trying to dry out the filters with moist air. Second, Tesla, if you needed a way to dry these filters out without using this cold, moist air, I think you could potentially turn this entire system into an oven. If you close all of these ducts and send a little bit of heat to this condenser, this entire area will heat up a little bit. You'll make more room in the air for humidity to come off of this filter. And then maybe you could just crack this door open a little bit to let some of that humid air out. Now I'm not sure if we still need a drying technique or not. If you address the issue from the first video that came out, we might not need this at all. But I acknowledge that there might be yet another issue that I haven't discovered yet, because the issue that I found doesn't explain why people are getting stinky filters when they live in the desert where it's super dry. And another option for Tesla or any of the aftermarket manufacturers, I noticed that there's like a little, this almost looks like Elmer's glue or something that they put on this tab. I'm guessing it's to keep it from ripping or maybe to give us some grip. But this looks pretty waterproof. It would be interesting if you modified your manufacturing processes to not add this just here, but to add it all along the bottom. If these manufacturers had waterproofed the bottom here, then we might have actually prevented smells from both issues, which would have been pretty interesting. Now, if you don't work for Tesla, there are a couple options to try to keep your car from absorbing moisture. One of which is this open cell foam style filter. I hate that in 2023, it seems like there are a billion of identical products on every platform, all with a bunch of different brand names. This seems to be one of those cases. This one's made by Technor, but like I say, there's a bunch of others. But the interesting thing about this style of filter is that it's got all this open cell foam around the outside of it, which I think is going to prevent this from absorbing moisture. Now the caveat to this style of filter is that there's a lot less area for air to pass through, and so I think this is going to restrict airflow a lot more than the original filter would. But I had the anemometer hooked up from earlier, and yes, airflow is reduced by about 25% when using this Technor filter. Now again, if cooling your car takes 2 minutes, then that 25% is really only about 30 seconds, so it's up to you if that matters or not. Now it is possible if you wanted to stack these up, so the Technor filters on the bottom and the OEM style filters on top, you'd only reduce it by about 12.5% then, but it's up to you. So I didn't want to just say that this filter was waterproof, and so I got this really fancy moisture testing kit. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix up some solution here. I'm going to add it to this bowl. We're going to let both of these filters soak for a couple hours, and we're going to see what the difference is. Got a nice clickbait green here. I'm just going to set this in here. So it's been over an hour and I wanted to take a look at what's going on here. So we can see with this original filter, quite a bit has soaked up and gotten into the actual filter element. So of course this one's going to start to stink. But with this X-Technor filter, it doesn't look like any of the moisture has soaked up into this open cell foam. And so with this X-Technor filter, I don't think we're going to have any kind of a condensation issue collecting in the bottom here. But I still recommend the Wix filter with the microband, but we need to modify it a little bit so that it doesn't accept any of the moisture that's on the bottom of this filter above this drain hole. And so what I came up with is I 3D printed this little clip. I'm going to show you how to install this quick. So if we look at this drain here, this drain isn't actually completely centered on this filter. If we measure, it is about 4 1/4 inches to the center of this drain. So I'm going to measure 4 1/4 inches from the side of the filter with the tab, and I'm just going to put a little mark here with a pencil. So I'm going to take my 3D printed clip, I'm going to put it over the top here like this, and now I'm going to push down here. I'm going to deform the filter a little bit so I can get these hooks over the top of it, something like this. Now when we install this plastic cover will be on top of the drain, and so water won't be able to condense into our filter. I've gone for another drive and I just got back. Humidity of this bottom filter is really 0 everywhere. So now I'm going to take this clip, install it on the bottom of this filter. So I've installed this clip on the bottom of the filter. I'm going to put it back in. I've waited about 25 minutes. I'm going to pop off this clip and we are going to measure the moisture of this filter. 14%, 15, 11, 15, 11. So I think it's too subjective for me to prove it, but I think if any part of this filter gets above 30 or 40% moisture, I start to notice a smell. Now, Tesla's technique to dry out these filters feels like a Band-Aid to a problem. And then adding this clip is now a Band-Aid on top of a Band-Aid, but it does seem like this has resolved this issue. I'm not convinced that this is the only issue that we're going to find, but I think this has resolved this issue. Now the caveat to this clip is that if you're not patient and you don't attach this really well to the bottom of the filter, or you just yank the filter out and this catches here, this thing could get lost inside of there, and it's going to be a pain in the butt to get it back out of there. I personally haven't had this issue in the past, but I thought it was worth mentioning as a warning to be super careful when installing and uninstalling this clip. I have had a little bit of time to practice with one of these little grabber tools, and it is pretty easy for me to get it out while I can see it, but I can't get my head up here to look down when this is installed in the car. So if you do end up losing this clip inside of here, you're going to want to use your phone in video camera mode, but you're going to want to turn the flashlight on so you can use your camera as a viewfinder to get the clip out of there. I leaned on 3D printing a ton in this video, everything from camera holders to meter holders to the actual solution. Designing something like this is super simple. It's just a sketch and then you extrude it into 3D, and then you can draw another sketch on that thing you just extruded and then just cut through it and you're done. If you have a 3D printer, then you can have this thing out and installed in your car within maybe 30 minutes. I'll put a link in the description to the model and the design files. Feel free to tweak it, sell it, whatever you want to do. If you don't have a 3D printer and it's something you're thinking about getting into, I will put a link in the description to both an entry-level machine and some nicer machines that you'll fuss with a little bit less. When I did the first video, I didn't expect it to turn into a series, but it seems like that might be what this is becoming. It sounds like a lot of you have issues with your HEPA filter, where the HEPA filter is causing an odor. Now, I don't have a Tesla with a HEPA filter. If you live in Western New York and you have a Tesla with a HEPA filter, don't mind some random stranger in the internet tearing it apart and flooding it with water, then please leave a comment and let me know how I can get a hold of you. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and I hope you found this helpful.